All right, so before we get started talking about the next reading assignment, I want to talk with you a little bit about what all of this is adding up to. So your first paper is going to be based on the reading and arguing that we've been doing over the last 2 weeks, right? So this is the question that I want you to try to answer, right? To what extent does human action have any meaningful impact on the world? And I'm not asking for your opinion on this per se, right? I'm not asking you to tell me what you really think about this and why. What I am asking for is what you think you can prove using the essays we've been reading as sources, right? So you are going to have to use at least 5 of them. In fact, try to stick to 5. Try not to use more than 5. The paper has to be 1,000 to 1,500 words, right? If you are under 1,000 words, right, that is the minimum acceptable word count, then you're not saying enough. If you are over 1,500, then you are saying too much and probably need to scale back a little bit. Yes, Chase?
So, 1,000 minimum.
1,000 is the absolute minimum word count, yes. Yes. So like roughly 4 pages double spaced. And remember too that some of that is going to be quotation, right? I do want you to quote directly from these essays, right? I know that in some disciplines you summarize and paraphrase rather than quoting. In English we don't do that. In English we quote things directly, right? I want to see exactly what passages you're getting your ideas from. So make sure that you are quoting directly. Also, this is probably going to be not like an absolute thing. It's like, yes, human action does have an impact, or no, it doesn't. What I want you to do is think of it as a kind of continuum, right? It's a to what extent question, not a yes or no question. Okay, so we're going to work on the paper in class on Tuesday the 27th. So you will, you can have all your materials here with you, you can have a laptop with you, and you can work on the paper here, right? And I will, I'll be here to answer questions that you have as you're working, right? If you want help as you're working, then please just do ask for it. I do also give extra credit for going to the Writing Center. So if you take this to the Writing Center, right, make sure you bring the assignment sheet with you so they know what it is you're doing. Then if I get an email back from them that says, Alan came to the Writing Center and we talked about blah, then you get half a letter grades extra credit, right? So suddenly that C plus you turned in becomes a B minus, yeah? This is a good thing, right? We like this, we all want this. So keep that in mind. Okay, right, other issues, right? Okay, please do pay attention to the formatting guidelines. I really do need it to be in 12-point type, Times New Roman font, double spaced. That just makes it a lot easier for me to read your paper. Any quotation you do, right, when you do the notation for that, needs to be MLA-style parenthetical notation. Does everybody understand what parenthetical notation means, what that is? Okay, parenthetical notation, what the hell did I do with the good marker? Here we go. Okay, so parenthetical notation works like this. Right, you have your quote, and at the end of said quote, in parentheses, you give me the author name and the page number, right? That's it, it's that simple. Author name and page number after quote. The other thing that I want to see you doing, right, if you're quoting from a source text, I want you to try to integrate the quotes into your own sentences rather than simply dropping them in, right? Don't just drop in the quote without warning. Set it up for your reader first. So something as simple as, like, as David Hume writes, comma, quote, or, Camus gives evidence of this here, colon, quote, notation, right? That's all I mean by that. Another thing about quotation, right? Quotes do not serve as self-evident propositions, right? I'm not always going to be able to clearly, I'm not going to be able to make assumptions about why you think a quote means what you think it does. So every time you quote, you need to explain to me why you're interpreting it in that particular way, right? Do you remember not too long ago we did that claim, data, warrant thing? Do you guys remember how this worked? So the claim is the thing I'm trying to argue. The data is the evidence that I'm using to back it up. And the warrant is the logical connection between the two, right? I think the example we used was, right, I am a US citizen. The data was that I was born in Pennsylvania. And the warrant for that, the logical link between the two, is that Pennsylvania is in the US, and anyone born on US soil is a citizen. So what you need to do is make sure when you quote that you are always providing me with that warrant, right? That you're always providing me with that logical connection between the evidence and your interpretation of it. Got it? Makes sense. Okay. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say about this for now. Do you guys have any questions?
Man, as long as this is all up on the Georgia View.
This is on Georgia View, yeah. And there's another page which talks a little bit about grading standards as well. You might want to read over. Yeah, that's going to be speaking mostly about how to organize your paper so as to make it make sense to another person. Right. That is one thing to know, right? Is that I can't read your minds. So you do need to actually arrange your arguments in such a way that someone who is not you and does not have direct access to your thoughts can understand it, right? Now, one way you might want to try to arrange this particular paper is by thinking in terms of the various big questions that each set of texts is asked, right? So the first was about being in reality, right? So establishing, right, what is real? Right, what exists? So once I establish what exists, right, then I can start thinking about things like, how do I process and describe what exists? Right, the language and thought unit. Then am I free to act upon whatever it is exists? Or am I constrained in some way? Right, fourth, what constitutes a good or a bad action? And finally, does the world as it exists have any inherent meaning or purpose. Right. And that last one is what you're going to be dealing with next time, right? The set of readings you're going to be doing next time is going to deal with whether human life has any particular purpose. So, Chase and Caressa, who is not here, you will be working on Seneca. Brian and Alan will be working on Michel de Montaigne. Cindy, Campy, and Xavier will be working on Schopenhauer. And Lily and Mackenzie will be working on Camus. Lily should be done with the theater thing next week and should be back. Okay, so let me know when you're ready for me to hit you with the discussion questions for this.
So for this essay, it's not going to be like you, because I don't know, it sounds like you have your own opinion, then you use the sources to back up your opinion.
Yeah, you are forming an opinion, you're forming an argument, really, based on what your sources have said, right? So you are choosing your sources to back up a particular point, but you can't make an argument that the sources don't support, right?
Okay. So I can have like I say what I to back up the questions with the sources.
Essentially, yeah. You're using the sources to answer these various questions, right? And
Based
all
on my opinion.
based on your reading of the sources.
Oh.
So, what you're going to want to do, right, is try to answer each of these questions. Pick at least one text that answers each of these questions. And try to figure out how this sort of relates to the idea of whether human action has any particular purpose or meaning. Right? Whether we can actually do anything to change the world as it is. Okay? Everybody good? All right, then let me give you the discussion questions for next time. All right, so those of you who are working on Seneca, right, what large claims does Seneca make for the practice of philosophy? And how does he think practicing philosophy makes us better people? Secondly, does Seneca believe that we should care about seeking the good opinion of other people? What does he think happens to us if we worry too much about what others think of us? Third, what kinds of pleasures does Seneca argue that his reader should embrace, and which should the reader avoid, and so what? And finally, what does Seneca seem to regard as the purpose of an individual's life? Anybody still need this, or shall I move on? Go? Okay. All right, if you're working on Montaigne, how does Montaigne think that reason is related to experience? Which does he consider superior? And of what use is the other, right? Of what use is the one he considers inferior? Secondly, what is Montaigne's attitude towards the material world and the range of sensory pleasures it provides? Number three, how do you think Montaigne would define the purpose of philosophy? Are there kinds of philosophy that help give life meaning and kinds that do not? And finally, can an action that is necessary, according to Montaigne, also be pleasurable, and so what? Got it? Okay. All right, for Schopenhauer, and I'm going to warn those of you working on Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is a real friggin' downer. All right, so how does Schopenhauer relate the flow of time to human striving for fulfillment? How does he describe the way we experience time? Secondly, using context clues, because he's not going to tell you outright, how do you think Schopenhauer would define happiness? does he seem to think that it is or is not achievable? Third, what is will? And what does it have to do with our ability or inability to be happy? And finally, the most famous line of this essay is, human life must be some kind of mistake. What does Schopenhauer mean by this? And how is it related to his idea of human happiness? And finally, for Camus. First, it's probably a good idea, before you start reading this, to familiarize yourself with the Greek myth that Camus uses to illustrate his argument here. Are any of you familiar with the myth of Sisyphus already? Do you know who Sisyphus was? Okay, so Sisyphus was an ancient Greek king who tricked the gods into giving him several years of extra life. And as punishment for this, the gods sent him down to the underworld, and he was forced for the rest of eternity to push a heavy rock up a hill. And every time he would get to the top of the hill, the rock would roll back down to the bottom, and he'd have to start over again, right? So his eternal punishment is this difficult, exhausting, and futile task that never ends, right? So what I want you to think about is how Sisyphus is an apt figure for the point that Camus is trying to make here. Secondly, Camus calls Sisyphus the absurd hero. In what ways does he see Sisyphus as heroic, and what does it mean to be an absurd hero? Camus claims to be most interested in Sisyphus at the moment when the rock he has been pushing rolls back down to the bottom of the hill. What does he think Sisyphus does or thinks about as he returns to begin his labor over again? And finally, at the end of the essay, Camus says, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why does he think Sisyphus finds happiness in this endless, pointless endeavor? All right, and that's it as far as these are concerned, right? So for today, here's what I want you thinking about as you break out into your pairs. Okay, so today we're talking about morality, about what it means to be moral, about what it means to be virtuous, and about what it means to live a good life, right? How we define living a good life, right? So we've already established at least what several philosophers think is real, actually exists in the world. We've talked and thought about how our ideas are related to, how our ideas are related to things in the world and how we try to describe things in the world. And whether or not we have freedom to act as we choose, right? So the things I want you thinking about today right, in addition to the specific questions that I gave you about your assigned thinker, right, are first, what matters more to your thinker? Individual virtue, or the public good? And secondly, what would your assigned philosopher define as good? Right. This is often this is a less clear idea than it often sounds, right? We tend to think we have some idea of what the good is, or what good ought to be. But some of the thinkers you guys are working with are going to have ideas of what is good that may seem a little bit contradictory, or that may at least seem to sort of cut against conventional wisdom. So I want you thinking about how exactly your philosopher would define the good, right? That which we ought to be striving for. All right, so you can go ahead and break up into your groups. So if you are working on Aristotle, come over here. If you're working on David Hume, over here. If you're working on John Stuart Mill, over here. And if you're working on Nietzsche, over on the other side of the room there. Stay far, far away, Nietzsche.